The siege of King's Landing. Elia tightened the cloak around her shoulders, the early morning air biting and far colder than the warmth she had left behind in her chambers within the Red Keep. But no chill could deter her, not today. She stood atop the gatehouse of the Gate of the Gods, the highest point from which she could witness what was unfolding below. The courtyard behind her had been scrubbed clean of the blood and remnants of the recent battle, yet in her mind's eye, the stones still bore a faint crimson hue, a haunting reminder of the violence that had so recently stained them. But it was not the courtyard that held her attention now. Her gaze was fixed beyond the walls, on the sight she had prayed for, had begged for with every fiber of her being. Before the walls stood an army, a sea of gleaming gold cloaks, their armor and spears catching the first light of dawn. The soldiers, every one of them excused from their duties within the city, were arrayed in perfect formation. At the forefront, a small retinue surrounded a mounted figure, a man who commanded the attention of all who beheld him. He was clad in darkened plate armor, the metal a stark contrast to the gold of the cloaks, and over his shoulder hung a golden cape that fluttered in the cool breeze. Though his face was obscured by his helm, Elia knew that if he were to turn, she would see the engraved crown on his cuirass, and beneath the shadow of his helmet, those striking blue-green eyes she knew so well. Christopher Mudd carried himself with the dignity of a king as he sat astride his mount, his posture commanding and regal. He was her son's hand and regent, and he had proven himself to be her son's fiercest protector. It was not just her children who had come to admire him. Christopher had an ability to create an impression upon anyone. There was a painful truth that Elia could not ignore. She was a widowed woman, her health fragile, and the possibility of bearing more children had been stolen from her by poor health. Christopher needed a wife who could provide him with heirs, someone younger, healthier, and capable of ensuring the future of House Mudd. The thought of it stirred something deep within her, a bittersweet ache she could not fully suppress. Still, she took solace in the care of Maester Allard, whose skill had brought her unexpected relief. The migraines that once plagued her were now a distant memory, and the fatigue that had weighed her down for years had lifted, leaving her with a strength she hadn't felt in a long time. Perhaps it was not just Maester Allard's ministrations that had renewed her, but the knowledge that her children were finally safe, their future secured. The death of her good father, tragic as it was, had brought an end to a dark chapter, and the appointment of the new Kingsguard had ushered in a sense of stability. Christopher's choices had been impeccable, appointing knights who were unwavering in their loyalty to House Targaryen and her children. Whispers in the court had begun to circulate, comparing Christopher Mudd to Unwin Peake, some noting the favor he showed to his cousin and foster brother by appointing them to his small council. But as Elia watched him, she could think of no one less like Unwin Peake, or even the more recent example of Owen Merriweather. Christopher's every action, from his visits to her children to his careful selection of the new Kingsguard, spoke of a man who placed the well-being of House Targaryen above all else. He had certainly accumulated power, but never at the expense of her children. She knew that no hand could be without ambition or personal goals, but Christopher seemed to have found a perfect balance in her mind, using his influence to fortify the realm rather than undermine it. Elia's gaze finally shifted past Christopher, settling on the camp that lay further from the city. Even from this distance, the remnants of the recent raid were unmistakable, soot-covered tents standing as grim memorials to the violence and fires that had ravaged the area. Days had passed, yet the scars of the attack remained raw and unhealed. Before the blackened tents, the assembled forces of Lord Tywin Lannister and Lord Rickard Karstark presented a stark contrast. Banners of the lion, direwolf, and pale sun fluttered in the breeze, their bold colours signalling the might of Lannister, Stark, and Karstark. But the numbers beneath those banners were not what they once were. Christopher had informed her that the force had been greatly diminished from its original 12,000. After the Battle of the Gate and the subsequent raid, their numbers had dwindled to closer to 7,000, almost half of what Lord Lannister had brought to bear. Elia struggled to muster any sympathy for the loss of soldiers who would have slain her children without hesitation if their lord had commanded it. Perhaps that was harsh, but she knew with certainty that these men would have no qualms about sacking King's Landing if it were Lord Tywin's will at the very least. Despite outnumbering Christopher's gold cloaks by 3,000 men, the rebels under Lord Tywin had made no move to advance. The Lannisters had hastily formed ranks as the sun revealed the massed gold cloaks standing outside the city's gate, a silent warning since just before sunrise. "My queen," came the voice of Sir Veltries, who stood protectively at her side. The newly appointed Kingsguard had been tireless in his duties, his vigilance unwavering as he ensured the safety of the small royal family that remained in King's Landing. The Sunglass Knight had been reluctant to let her leave the Red Keep, even as she had ridden out with the gold cloaks, determined to follow Christopher. But she had insisted, this was something she would not miss, no matter the danger. "Yes, sir?" she asked, turning to her shadow. He nodded toward the horizon, his eyes sharp and focused. Elia followed his gaze, and there, at last, she saw what they had been waiting for all morning. On the horizon, a new host appeared, their banners catching the first light of dawn. The green and gold of House Tyrell was the most welcome sight Elia had seen in a long time. Beside the golden roses flew the red huntsmen of Tarly, the purple grapes of Redwine, the golden trees of Rowan, and the orange foxes of House Florent. A wave of cavalry rode ahead of the marching infantry, moving swiftly toward the rebels. It didn't take long for the rebels to realize the gravity of their situation. There was a hurried shuffling in their ranks as half of them turned to face the approaching Reachmen. But as they took in the sheer numbers of the force arrayed against them, numbers that surely doubled their own even without counting the gold cloaks, their resolve wavered. The Reachman cavalry halted just short of the rebel lines, and Elia watched with bated breath as two riders broke away from the main force, advancing even closer. She could see them shouting something to Lord Tywin and his men. Tension hung heavy in the air, the possibility of battle still very real. Elia could do nothing but watch in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt as if time itself had slowed, every moment drawn out to an agonizing length. Then, finally, she saw it, the rebel banners beginning to dip, one by one. Relief flooded through her as the realization sank in. The black and white sun of House Karstark was the penultimate to fall, followed lastly by the grey dire wolf of House Stark. And so, the siege of King's Landing ended. The rest of the Reach host had now fully arrived, moving swiftly among the rebel forces, separating them, and capturing lords, knights, arms, and supplies from the camp. The rebels were disarmed and subdued, their once proud ranks reduced to prisoners in the wake of their defeat. Beneath the city walls, she saw half of the gold cloaks break away and return to the safety of King's Landing, their task complete. The remaining gold cloaks moved to meet the Tyrell host, joining forces as the two armies began to secure the battlefield. Within the hour, they began their return, marching toward the gatehouse where Elia stood. It would have been satisfying to look down upon Lord Tywin as he was brought beneath the city's walls, but what she desired even more was to stand face to face with him, to look directly into his pale green eyes and see the man who had dared to threaten her children. "I wish to be in the courtyard, Sir Veltries," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. Her Kingsguard hesitated for a moment, searching her gaze as if weighing the risks. Then, with a nod of assent, he replied, "Very well, my queen." Sir Veltries led the way down from the massive walls, his armored form a shield between her and any lingering dangers. They descended the stone steps in silence, their footsteps echoing softly in the narrow passageway. As they reached the bottom and stepped into the courtyard, Elia's eyes fell upon a familiar sight, her mount, waiting patiently for her. It was a pale sand steed, a horse she had not ridden since before her wedding. The mare's sleek coat shimmered like the sands of dawn, a poignant reminder of the home Elia had left behind. Unlike most sand steeds, known for their fiery tempers and unyielding spirit, traits that mirrored the fierce independence of the Dornish people, this mare was different. She had been a gift from her brother, Loren, chosen for her calm demeanor and gentle nature, a rare find among her kind. Sir Veltries approached her with care, his strong hands steady as he helped her mount the horse. He adjusted the reins and stirrups, ensuring that she was comfortable and secure in the saddle before moving to his own mount. They sat in silence, side by side, their eyes trained on the gatehouse as they waited for the armies to return. The moments stretched, filled with the quiet anticipation of what was to come. The mare stood patiently beneath Elia, her calmness a steadying force against the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first men began to appear, their figures growing larger as they approached the gatehouse. At the very head of the column was Christopher, his darkened armor unmistakable even from a distance. Beside him rode a portly man with a broad, beaming smile, Lord Mace Tyrell, his presence as commanding as it was affable. Flanking Lord Tyrell was the severe Lord Randall Tarley, his expression as stern and unforgiving as his reputation suggested, and another serious-looking man she quickly recognized by the golden tree emblazoned on his chest, Lord Mathis Rowan. As they drew nearer, the courtyard buzzed with the sound of hooves and the murmurs of soldiers. Elia straightened in her saddle, her eyes meeting Christopher's for a brief moment before she allowed her gaze to sweep over the rest of the approaching lords. Lord Mace Tyrell's eyes widened in surprise at the sight of Elia, and with a subtle shift, the leading lords altered their course, steering their mounts toward her and Sir Valtry's. As the procession continued, gold cloaks, reachmen, and captured rebels filed into the city, their faces a mixture of relief and resignation. The lords, however, rode directly up to her. Christopher positioned his horse between them, glancing back and forth as he spoke with measured authority. "My lords, may I present Queen Mother Elia Martell, and Sir Valtry's Sunglass of the Kingsguard," he announced, his tone formal yet warm. Elia had met all three lords before, most recently at Harrenhal, so the introduction was likely more for Sir Valtry's and the significance of his new position. House Sunglass, though one of the Targaryens' original vassals from their days as Lords of Dragonstone, had never achieved the prominence of houses Velaryon or Celtigar, despite their unwavering loyalty through the centuries. The Reach lords exchanged brief glances of surprise, with Lord Mace blinking as his gaze shifted to the white cloak fastened over Sir Valtry's shoulders. Lord Randall and Lord Mathis, more reserved, offered respectful nods, acknowledging both Elia and Sir Valtry's before their attention returned to her. Lord Mace, slower to react, eventually followed suit, his usual affable demeanor slightly tempered by the unexpected introduction. "A pleasure to meet you again, Your Grace," Lord Mace finally said, his voice buoyant but laced with a hint of curiosity. "And let me extend my congratulations to you, Sir Valtry's, on your appointment. The Kingsguard is the greatest order of knights in the realm." "Thank you, my lord," Sir Valtry's replied succinctly, his tone polite. Elia glanced between Lord Mace and her knight for a moment, sensing the subtle undercurrents of the exchange. Then, with the grace and poise expected of her, she turned her attention back to the lords. "It was a most welcome sight to see you and your men, Lord Tyrell," she said courteously, her voice carrying a warmth that belied the tension of the morning. She offered a nod to the two other lords in acknowledgement. "Well then, I must return the compliment, for the sight of you is most welcome as well," Lord Mace responded, his broad smile lighting up his face once more. "You look possibly more beautiful than ever before." Elia offered a smaller, polite smile in return. "I thank you for your kind words, Lord Mace." Turning to Christopher, she inclined her head slightly. "Mayhaps we shall make for the Red Keep now?" Christopher held her gaze for a moment, a silent exchange passing between them before he gave a slight nod. "A sound suggestion, Your Grace," he agreed. Just as Elia was about to move, something caught her eye that made her pause. Atop a great war horse, as imperious as ever, came Lord Tywin Lannister. His resplendent armor, engraved with the Lion of House Lannister, gleamed coldly in the morning light. The elder lord rode past with an air of authority, escorted by a dozen mounted gold cloaks who flanked him like a protective wall. Lord Tywin's gaze never wavered from the path ahead, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. Yet, despite his seemingly singular focus, Elia could sense that nothing in the courtyard escaped his notice. His presence was commanding, a silent reminder of the power he wielded even in defeat. Elia felt both anger and fear well up in her stomach as she watched Lord Tywin ride past. The anger was understandable, a natural response to the man who had so recently threatened her children and her life, even if it was now unnecessary. But the fear, irritating, instinctive, and unwelcome, was something she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the memory of the siege or the knowledge of what might have been, it was the realization that even in defeat, Lord Tywin was still a formidable force. Anyone who did not think him dangerous, even as a captive, was either blind or a fool. His true strength lay not in his abilities of the sword, but in his sharp wit and silver tongue. Unless they silenced him permanently, by cutting out his tongue or severing his head, his threat was ever present, a looming shadow even behind bars. Elia realized she had been holding her breath as Lord Tywin finally disappeared from sight between the buildings. In his wake came dozens of other highborn hostages, their faces marked by defeat and exhaustion. Among them, the most recognizable was the dejected figure of Sir Barristan Selmy, stripped of his white cloak. The sight of the once honorable knight, now turned traitor, weighed heavily on her. She dearly hoped he would not be sentenced to the block. It was something she would need to discuss with Christopher. Behind Sir Barristan, 2 older men bearing the yellow lion of House Grandison walked in a somber line. One was wounded, leaning heavily on the other for support. Elia's heart tightened at the sight, remembering Sir Harlan Grandison, who had served as a loyal Kingsguard before dying peacefully in his sleep just before the ill-fated journey to Harrenhal nearly 4 years ago. She couldn't help but think that Sir Harlan would be heartbroken to see his nephews fighting against the family he had devoted his life to protecting. Sir Kevan Lannister followed, surrounded by a small crowd of lesser Lannisters, none of whom she recognized. Unlike his nervous cousins, Sir Kevan wore the same expressionless mask as his elder brother, his stoic demeanor betraying nothing of the turmoil that surely brewed beneath. The citizenry would soon gather in Cobbler's Square to witness the defeated paraded past, but here, within the safety of the thousands of gold cloaks, there was little threat to these prisoners. Elia noticed Christopher had ridden up beside her, his presence a quiet comfort amidst the tension. She turned to him slightly, her voice soft but firm. "The rebels have been gutted of many of their lords by your actions, Lord Hand." Christopher tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the procession of Stormlords that followed. Their heraldry, Penrose, Buckler, Tarth, Fell, Hawpe, and a number of the sons and grandsons of Lord Estamont. "I suppose that is true," he eventually conceded. "Yet the war continues. Thousands more will perish, for Robert Baratheon still lives." Her eyebrows arched in surprise. "How do you know that?" "Varys has informed me of reports," Christopher replied, his tone measured. A small retinue of Baratheon men at arms was seen escorting a cart holding a wounded warrior. The small folk didn't catch his appearance, but the most likely candidate is obvious. Elia felt a chill at the implications of his words. Robert Baratheon's survival meant that the rebellion was far from over, and the bloodshed would continue. As they watched, the Stormlords passed by, followed by a few Riverlords. Among them was a cart draped with a black trout tully banner, led by 2 Tarly men at arms. Elia noticed Christopher's gaze fix intently on one particular lord, a man with a small black beard and the sigil of a weirwood tree upon his chest. The name of Lord Blackwood momentarily eluded her, but she recognized the house. Their daughter had been the Queen of Aegon the Unlikely, the great-grandmother of her late husband. Suddenly, the reason for Christopher's focused attention became clear. "You met Lord Blackwood at Harrenhal, did you not?" Elia asked, recalling the fleeting moments she had observed them together during the tourney. Christopher's expression tightened slightly, a light grimace pulling at his features. "I did. We got along well. I even sparred with his younger brother, Sir Jamis." Elia hesitated, unsure of how to respond to the weight of his words. "There are many good men who ended up on the opposite side in this war," Christopher continued, his voice tinged with regret. "If the realm wishes to heal, compromises will have to be found." Elia glanced at the Reach Lords, who had respectfully distanced themselves, granting them a semblance of privacy. Lowering her voice, she met Christopher's now focused eyes. "This is true. But certain lords?" she inquired quietly. Christopher remained silent for a moment, watching her closely. Finally, with a grimace, he spoke. It would be highly unpopular, regardless of his opportunistic entrance into the war. She stared at him, feeling a pang of betrayal. Was he truly suggesting this? The man who had wished to kill her children. Your Grace, Christopher began, sensing her turmoil, but she turned slightly away, taking deep breaths to steady herself. Elia, he continued, his voice softer, I would hate to have seen him succeed. For your children, I wish only good health and long lives. At the sound of her name, she reluctantly turned back to face him. And yet? Her voice trembled with controlled anger. You say their lives and health are your wish, yet you won't end that wretch's life for his betrayal and treason. Christopher's eyes darkened, though his tone remained measured and polite. Now that is unfair, Elia. Don't act childish. There is a reason why Lord Tywin is in this position, and it's the same reason why I cannot harm him directly. His surrender, no matter how begrudging, grants him certain rights. To walk back on that would be seen as tyrannical and would only harm the realm. Elia's anger simmered beneath the surface, her emotions warring with the logic in Christopher's words. She knew the reality of politics, the delicate balance that had to be maintained, but the idea of sparing Tywin Lannister, the man who had come so close to destroying her family, was almost too much to bear. Rights granted under surrender are almost as sacred and crucial in these lands as the institution of guest right, Christopher continued, his voice calm but firm. Elia's eyes narrowed as she recalled one prominent historical example where such principles were disregarded, and it seemed Christopher was thinking of the same. The betrayal of the young dragon is still demonized to this day. Do you truly wish to pin your son with such a legacy? I act and speak with his authority and voice, my actions will reflect on him. Of course not, she hissed quietly, her tone sharp as her gaze flicked toward the Reach Lords, who were growing impatient and had inched closer. Christopher held her gaze for a moment longer, his expression unwavering. Good, he said, a note of finality in his voice. This is a time of celebration. The repercussions of the war can be discussed later. I promise you, Elia, that Tywin Lannister will feel the weight of his treason. Before she could respond, Christopher turned to the Reach Lords, his tone polite but firm. Let us ride for the Red Keep, my lords. Lord Mathis and Lord Mace briefly glanced at her, curiosity evident in their expressions, though Lord Mace did a poor job of concealing his. Without a word though, they fell into formation and began the journey to the Red Keep. Elia sighed before she followed with Sir Valtry's forming up behind her. Hopefully, Christopher would see the truth of her words before long. A lion was not an animal that one could tame, and Tywin Lannister lived up to his family's sigil. Sarah brushed away the tear on her cheek, standing by the window as she gazed out at the familiar yet unsettling view. The dark waters of the God's Eye, with the Isle of Faces in the distance, had always fascinated her, but now they just reminded her of everything that had gone wrong. Her brothers, Stefan, Willem, and Walton, had been so full of life, eager to prove themselves as knights. But they had returned from the Trident cold and lifeless, leaving her with only Simond, her younger brother. It felt like a cruel joke, losing 3 brothers in one blow. She had turned to the 7, praying for answers, but the gods had been silent. Even the sept, which used to bring her comfort, now felt empty. Sarah sighed and turned away from the window. The thought of the Isle of Faces crossed her mind, but she pushed it away. Her father had always forbidden them from going there, and besides, what could old trees tell her that the gods hadn't? It was a foolish idea, she concluded. Still, she felt so alone. Her father was crushed by grief, her mother had become distant, and Simond barely spoke to her anymore. The Kingspire, once filled with life, now seemed haunted by the memories of her brothers. Sarah could hardly believe how much her life had changed since the tourney at Harrenhal. That had been the pinnacle, a dream come true. Lords, knights, and even Prince Rhaegar himself had come to her home. She had been the initial queen of love and beauty, and for a while, it felt like nothing could ever go wrong. Even when her brothers and uncle were knocked out of the lists, she had still been riding the high of it all, wrapped in the magic of that moment. The tourney had been filled with handsome lords and knights, all vying for attention, showering her with compliments and asking her to dance. But there was one young man who stood out to her. He wasn't the most handsome. Sir Jaime Lannister or Prince Oberyn Martell were more striking, she knew, but there was something about him. He had a quiet confidence, not the brazen arrogance of the other men, and that intrigued her. She remembered their dance as if it had just happened. It felt like something out of a song, a perfect moment where everything else faded away. She had been filled with a mix of joy and nervousness, barely able to speak, but it hadn't mattered. The dance was over too soon, and before she knew it, Stefan had come to whisk her away. Still, she could recall the gentle kiss on her hand before they parted, a moment that stayed with her long after the music ended. That day had been the best of her life, even when her mother had insisted she return to her chambers, chaperoned by Stefan. Looking back, Sarah realized it might have been one of the last times she and Stefan were alone together. He had always been much older, and as they grew up, their interactions became less and more formal. The thought of him, so full of life then, brought fresh tears to her eyes. The end of the tourney had been a bitter one, though. At the time, she hadn't fully grasped the significance of what had happened. The slight to Princess Elia, the scandal of Prince Rhaegar naming Lyanna Stark as his Queen of Love and Beauty, it had all seemed like court gossip, something that would pass. But then the news came that Lady Lyanna had been abducted, and everything spiraled into chaos. Sarah had almost forgotten about the charming Sir Christopher Mudd, caught up in her worry and fear for her elder brothers as they marched off to war. First, they followed Lord Hoster Tully to the Stony Sept, and then, after Lord Tully was injured, they served under Robert Baratheon at the Trident. Those days had been a blur of anxiety, with little room for thoughts of the handsome knight she had danced with at the tourney. It wasn't until after the Battle of the Trident that strange rumours began to reach Harrenhal from King's Landing. Sir Christopher Mudd, the unexpected champion of the melee, had somehow become commander of the City Watch. No one even knew he had been a gold cloak, let alone one who would rise so quickly. Then, just a week later, more shocking news arrived: the death of the Mad King, the sack of the city by Tywin Lannister, and Sir Christopher Mudd named Hand of the King. Her father had laughed when he first heard it, thinking it a jest. Her mother had been dismissive, rolling her eyes at the absurdity of it all. But that changed after the Battle of the Gate and the slaughter on the King's Road. For the first time since her brother's deaths, Sarah saw something other than cold detachment in her mother's eyes, a spark of ambition, a glimmer of opportunity as she looked at her daughter. It was then that her mother revealed a letter from Sir Christopher, one that had been kept hidden from Sarah. Shocked and hurt, Sarah could barely process the fact that her parents had withheld something so personal from her. She remembered that day clearly, how the weight of everything had pressed down on her. Harrenhal, always a gloomy and foreboding place, had become unbearable in its emptiness. As a child, she had found some joy in exploring its many abandoned halls, but after the deaths of her brothers, the castle felt suffocating. The servants and occasional visitors had always whispered of ghosts and curses, tales of the burning by Aegon the Conqueror and his dragon, Balerion. The curse the castle's first lord was said to place as the dragon flame engulfed Black Harren. She had never seen a ghost herself or believed in the curse before, but the strange noises that echoed through the halls, even in the Kingspire Tower, were unsettling. The Tower of Dread and Widow's Tower, said to be the most haunted, were places she had never dared to explore. The curse of Harrenhal, where house after noble house had met its end, seemed all too real to her now. 6 noble houses had held Harrenhal since Aegon's conquest, and all had fallen. Was her family doomed to follow? As she settled onto the bed, her gaze drifted to the table beside her. The letter still lay there, its wax seal partially intact from when she had sliced it open to read. Sarah shifted on the bed and picked up the letter, holding it up to catch the glow of the bedside candle. The flickering light illuminated the remnants of the crown seal, casting a warm glow over the paper and drawing her attention back to its contents. Lady Sarah, I hope this letter finds you in good health despite the trying times we all face. I was deeply saddened to hear of the loss your family has suffered. Your brothers were fine men and knights, and it was tragic to learn of their fates. Although we did not speak much, you have remained in my thoughts ever since. These words cannot compensate for the loss of your brothers, but I hope they provide even a small measure of comfort in this difficult time. Yours sincerely, Sir Christopher Mudd. The letter was brief and formal, but Sarah was struck by the realization that it was the only message of condolence she had received directly. While everyone who cared had offered their sympathies to her parents, she had received no such words herself until now. Despite her sadness, Sarah felt a flicker of comfort in the knowledge that Sir Christopher had been thinking of her. Even if his gesture was merely a formality or a pretense, it was the first genuine solace she had experienced in weeks. At first, she hesitated even to think about responding. Distrustful and uncertain, she feared the letter might be some sort of trick. It took her time to overcome her reservations and consider how to express her own feelings. But still, she had not sent a reply. Sarah glanced out the window once more. Night had not yet fallen, and there was little else she could do to occupy her time. With a moment of hesitation, she set the letter down on the table and slipped out of bed. On the opposite side of her chambers stood a writing desk. She placed a fresh sheet of parchment on the desk before sitting down. Twice already, she had tried to write a reply. The first attempt had been so formal and detached that she was startled by the coldness of her own words when she read it over. She wanted to at least acknowledge their shared history and brief connection. The second attempt had turned into a pouring out of every fear, feeling, and thought that had plagued her. That letter had been so raw and personal that she burned it in the fireplace after reading just the first few lines. Surely there must be a middle ground? Sarah thought, and with that, she picked up her quill and began to write. Dear Christopher Mudd. But before she could continue, the sound of footsteps approaching her room made her pause. Instinctively, she hid the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. Why was she so nervous? A light knock on the door followed, and a voice called through it, "My lady." Sarah swallowed and then responded, "Enter." The door opened to reveal Pia, one of the servants. The pretty girl stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "My lady, I thought you ought to know that a guest has just arrived." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" The news seemed ordinary enough, but something in Pia's tone made her uneasy. Pia glanced around the room as if to ensure no one was eavesdropping. Then, with a spark of excitement in her eyes, she leaned in and whispered, "It is King Robert Baratheon himself." A pit of dread formed in Sarah's stomach as her eyes instinctively darted to the letter on her bedside table. Pia noticed the glance, her curiosity piqued. Sarah sprang from her chair, quickly positioning herself between Pia and the letter. Though Pia couldn't possibly see what was written from that distance, Sarah stood firmly in the way, taking deep breaths to steady herself. You should leave," Sarah stammered, noticing the surprise in Pia's eyes. "Thank you for the information, but I wish to be left alone now." She kept her tone firm, ensuring that the servant hadn't caught even a glimpse of the letter. Though logically, Pia wouldn't speak of the letter from their guest's greatest enemy in this war, Sarah wanted to eliminate any chance of such a situation arising. Pia, still visibly confused, curtsied and said, "My lady," before quietly leaving the room. As the door clicked shut, Sarah exhaled slowly, her heart still pounding. The letter remained hidden, but the unease clung to her. She refused to be the foolish, helpless girl her fears threatened to make her. That's why she wanted to be Christopher's wife, no matter how the war ended. In a way, he had become her savior, an anchor she could cling to in the storm that had become her life. Before the letter, she had been adrift, confused and lost, with dark thoughts circling her mind. More than once, she had gazed out the window, wondering if it was her only option. But now, at least, she was certain of one thing. Turning back to the writing desk, she pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. A foolish girl would struggle to write a letter. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Sarah steadied herself, quill in hand, and began to write, determined to find the right words. Christopher sat silently at the head of the small council table, his hands folded neatly before him. He had arrived early, as was his custom, and watched as the others filed in one by one. Varys was the first to join him, slipping into his seat with a quiet nod of acknowledgement, his face as unreadable as ever. Next came Robin and Adam, engaged in a hushed conversation, their voices a low murmur as they took their places. Princess Elia entered soon after, escorted by Lord Lucerys, who offered her a polite bow before guiding her to the chair beside Christopher. He then took his own seat with a practiced grace. Maester Allard was the next to arrive, his grey robes rustling softly as he moved to his seat. Close behind him were Lord Mace and Lord Randall. The two exchanged quick nods with the Maester before acknowledging each other with a respectful incline of the head. Randall Tarley, for now, temporary member of the council at Christopher's invitation, found his newly acquired chair beside Lord Mace. He took his place with a stoic expression that he so often wore. As the last of the council members took their places, the chamber doors closed with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating through the room, marking the beginning of the council session. "Welcome, my lords and your grace," Christopher began, his voice measured and deliberate as he ensured to acknowledge everyone with equal respect. His gaze swept across the table before settling on Lord Mace and Lord Randall. "Allow me to be the first to congratulate our new Master of Coin on his appointment," he continued, nodding toward Mace. "We are honored to have you with us as you take your seat today." Lord Mace responded with a practiced ease, his smile warm and reassuring. "Thank you, Lord Hand. I appreciate this honor and the opportunity to shepherd the realm in these turbulent times." "Fine words, my lord," Christopher replied politely, before turning his attention to Lord Randall. "And a welcome to you as well, Lord Randall. Though you hold no formal office on this council, your martial abilities are unparalleled." Randall Tarley gave a curt nod in acknowledgement, his expression impassive as he remained silent. Christopher, well accustomed to Lord Randall's reserved demeanor by now, continued without missing a beat. "First, I believe it must be said, the end of this war is in sight. As we speak, Dornish spears under Prince Oberyn Martell are marching through the Stormlands, not far from Storm's End. Last reports placed Robert Baratheon on the King's Road," Christopher added, glancing toward Varys for confirmation. He was surprised when the Master of Whispers shook his head. "Today, I received news that Robert Baratheon is currently licking his wounds and enjoying the hospitality of House Went at Harrenhal, my Lord Hand," Varys informed them in his soft, unassuming voice. Christopher blinked in surprise. It had been barely a week since the Reach forces had arrived, and the Lannisters had surrendered. Just 2 days ago, he had received a letter from Lady Shellerwent, expressing a desire to discuss terms and hinting at a possible marriage alliance between him and her daughter, Lady Sarah. Now, Varys was telling him that the Wents were hosting Robert Baratheon. He felt a flicker of doubt. Had he misjudged House Went? Were they playing both sides in this war? What was their true game, toying with the idea of an alliance with him while sheltering his enemies? Where are Lord Arryn and his forces now, then? Lord Randall inquired, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room as Christopher pondered the implications of Varys's news. Varys remained unfazed by the question, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I've received word that Lord Arryn and his host recently left the Mountains of the Moon via the High Road. They are presumably near Willowwood by now. Meanwhile, Lord Hoster Tully, leading a smaller contingent, has passed Stonehenge." Lord Mace raised an eyebrow in surprise. Is Lord Tully not still recovering from his injuries at the Battle of the Bells? Varys shook his head slowly. "Lord Tully's current condition remains a mystery even to me, but given that he is leading the Rivermen, I can only assume he is well enough to accompany the army." Christopher finally shook himself from his thoughts, having been lost in the implications of the unfolding situation. "It matters little," he said firmly. "In any battle, he is still wounded and will be forced to lead from the rear." The council seemed to accept this assessment, letting the matter drop as they turned their attention to the larger strategic concerns. Lord Randall leaned forward, his expression sharp with interest. "How do we envision this battle, Then, Lord Hand? Randall asked, his curiosity genuine. In response, Christopher gestured for a servant to bring forth the map. To answer your question, and to plan this battle, I will show it upon this map. Rising from his chair, he moved to stand beside the map now unfurled behind the king's seat, ensuring it was visible to all. He first pointed to the northern shore of the God's Eye. Robert Baratheon is here at Harrenhal, Christopher said, placing a yellow pin beside the letters spelling out Harrenhal. Next, he selected a light blue and a dark blue pin, placing one near Willow Wood, north of the Trident and west of the Vale, and the other on the river road near Stonehenge, further west from Harrenhal and the yellow pin. Lord John Arryn and Lord Hoster Tully and their respective hosts, Christopher introduced, noting the council's keen interest. We wish to know where the next battle will be fought, but the answer is already clear in my mind. Robert Baratheon is shaken. In one evening, he lost and was separated from his mighty army, just as he was at Ashford. Christopher nodded in acknowledgement to the Reach Lords, signaling their crucial role in that previous engagement. Randall Tarly remained impassive, his eyes calculating, while Mace Tyrell struggled to suppress a self-satisfied smile. The rebels will have a host in the southeast of the Riverlands, Christopher continued, trailing his finger northward from King's Landing along the King's Road, stopping at a seemingly unremarkable crossing of the Trident between the two blue pins. And a royalist host will have to march north to confront them. There was a murmur among the council as they absorbed the implications of his strategy. You believe he wishes to repeat history? Lord Randall asked, his tone thoughtful. Before Christopher could reply, Lord Mace interjected, surely he can't expect us to walk into the same mistake. Christopher turned to him with a raised eyebrow. What mistake would that be? Lord Mace hesitated, caught off guard. Well, whatever led to Prince Rhaegar's defeat at the Trident, Lord Hand. He had superior numbers, and yet he lost. Christopher glanced around the council, ensuring he had their full attention. It was no assured victory for the rebels. The battle could have gone either way until the Vale cavalry charged and the prince fell. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. I don't favor fighting at the Trident either, but I doubt we'll get a decisive battle anywhere else. The council remained silent for a moment, digesting Christopher's conclusion. Finally, Randall Tarly broke the stillness, nodding slowly as he spoke. I can agree with that assessment, Lord Hand. A decisive clash is indeed critical. The longer we allow this war to drag on, the harder it will be to secure a lasting peace, and the more extensive the rebuilding that will be required afterward. Christopher felt a sense of satisfaction as he considered Randall Tarly's presence on the council. The older man, nearing his 30th name day, was far more than just an exceptional military commander. He was educated, strategic, and understood the full spectrum of war, from the battlefield to the delicate peace that must follow. Randall was not a man driven by bloodlust, but by the necessity of order and stability, making him a valuable ally, even if his focus often left little room for matters outside strategy and tactics. Wise words, Lord Randall, Christopher acknowledged. I believe that if we march within the week, when Sir Baelor and Sir Garth arrive with the remainder of the Reach host, we will be well positioned to engage Robert Baratheon and bring this war to an end within the next moon. A murmur of agreement rippled through the council, the lords nodding in approval. Christopher briefly met the gaze of Elia, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. Her dark eyes held a mixture of worry and hope, emotions she dared not voice but which Christopher could clearly see. The weight of the realm's future rested on this council's decisions, and he knew Elia was acutely aware of that. He broke his gaze from hers as Maester Allard cleared his throat lightly. My lords, your grace, the Maester began, addressing the council before turning to Christopher. It may be prudent to conclude on the numbers of this host. Christopher nodded, a small smile on his lips. Yes, indeed. Proceed, Maester. Maester Allard adjusted the parchments before him and began to speak, his voice steady as he recited the figures. Our losses at the battle on the King's Road were significant, around 5,000 men, roughly a quarter of the original host ferried over the bay. A few hundred have since recovered from their wounds, bringing the host to a current strength of 15,000. He paused briefly, allowing the council to absorb the information before continuing. As of our last reports, the combined strength of our forces, excluding those stationed at or en route to Storm's End, should number around 35,000, based on the estimates provided to me. The maester looked around the table. This figure does not include the 5,000 gold cloaks stationed in King's Landing. While they could be drawn upon in an emergency, it is necessary to leave at least half in the city to maintain order and fulfill their duties. Christopher hummed thoughtfully before turning his attention to Varys. Estimates for the rebels' strength? Varys furrowed his brows, considering the question carefully. The two primary rebel hosts are estimated to be around 15 to 20,000 strong combined. He paused briefly, noting the council's reaction before continuing. It is important to note, however, that the rebel host at Briarwhite was not entirely destroyed or captured. Many Stormlanders managed to flee into the Crownlands and Riverlands. With news of Robert Baratheon's survival now circulating through the Crownlands, it is possible that some of these men may rally and return to their lord's banner. A murmur of concern rippled through the room, but Christopher remained composed, nodding at Varys' prediction. "This is understandable," he said, his tone measured. "It is, after all, what happened after they were scattered at Ashford. The remnants of Robert's forces regrouped, just as they may now." He paused, letting the council absorb his words before continuing with a note of finality. "Regardless of any resurgence in their numbers, we will outnumber them. Our forces are strong, and our strategy is sound. Tactics will be discussed in detail once we have certainty on where the battle will be fought." "Storm's End will fall," Christopher declared, his voice firm and resolute. "And Robert's brothers will either be under our control or rendered irrelevant. The momentum is in our favor, and I promise you all, I will not falter at the final obstacle." A brief silence followed, the gravity of Christopher's words settling over the room. Then, Lord Mace Tyrell cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I have news," he began, his tone a mix of seriousness and an attempt at levity. "And with no offense meant to you, Maester Allard, but I must point out that the process for selecting a new Grand Maester is rather more extensive than simply choosing the closest man with chains." Lord Mace offered a smile, seemingly seeking to lighten the mood. In certain circumstances, that approach could lead to quite unpleasant results. The attempt at humor fell flat in the reserved atmosphere of the council. After a few awkward moments, Lord Mace cleared his throat and continued, his tone more measured. "Yes, well, I received a missive from my uncle, informing me that the Archmaesters have conducted a thorough process and, almost unanimously, have decided upon a new Grand Maester to take over the office left vacant by the traitorous Pycelle." Christopher raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the news. Lord Mace straightened in his seat, his earlier attempt at levity now completely forgotten. "Maester Gorman Tyrell, my uncle, has been chosen for this honor. I suppose he is now called Grand Maester." Maester Allard showed little reaction, understanding that his role had always been temporary while awaiting the Citadel's decision. Christopher, however, was keen not to lose such a diligent and capable man. He turned to the visibly pleased Lord Mace, acknowledging the news with a measured response. "I am sure the new Grand Maester will serve with distinction," Christopher replied, his tone polite but non-committal. Then, he shifted his attention to Maester Allard, who had been listening quietly. "Maester Allard, when Grand Maester Gorman arrives, I would be honored to hire you as my personal maester. Until I hold a keep of my own, of course. I will ensure the Citadel receives the customary maester's fee." Maester Allard looked momentarily surprised, then deeply appreciative as he inclined his head. "It would be my privilege, Lord Hand," he responded, his voice steady with sincerity. "Wonderful," Christopher said, his tone signaling the end of the discussion. "Unless anyone has additional matters to bring before the council?" He glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of each council member. When no one offered any further comments, he gave a decisive nod. "Very well, if there are no further issues, this meeting is adjourned. My lords, your grace." Christopher had one final task before he could rest for the night. As he entered the quarters, he found them almost identical to Lord Eddard Stark's, imposing and meticulously arranged. Sitting before a roaring fireplace was the man who had summoned him, the shadows from the flickering flames playing across the stern face of Lord Tywin Lannister. The Lion of the Rock regarded Christopher with pale green eyes that tracked his movements with the predatory gaze of a hunter. Tywin made no attempt to initiate conversation, his silence heavy and expectant. Christopher poured himself a glass of watered arbor gold and settled into a chair opposite the Lannister lord. The quarters were lavishly decorated, a stark contrast to the austere confines of Maegor's Holdfast where Christopher had previously met with a captive. "Lord Tywin," Christopher greeted after taking a sip from his cup, his voice steady. Tywin's gaze remained as unyielding as ever. "Sir Christopher? Or should I address you by another title these days?" His tone was laced with a thin edge of derision. "Address me as you see fit," Christopher replied with a cool detachment. "Though, I must say, I've heard rumors about certain tongueless servants who might find such double standards rather upsetting. You were notably rigorous about titles, particularly when it concerned the office I now hold." The sharpness in Christopher's voice was accompanied by a hint of mockery, a small thrill coursing through him as he verbally sparred with the infamous lord. He was fully aware that this exchange might not be the wisest course of action, but he couldn't resist the challenge. Lord Tywin's eyes narrowed, his expression growing more severe. Before he could respond, Christopher pressed on. "I am not here to trade barbs," Christopher said firmly. "Instead, I wanted to discuss the war and our future." He paused, meeting Tywin's unyielding gaze. "You were unfortunate, your gambit was undone by a combination of my luck and your misfortune. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge your drive and grasping actions." Tywin's expression did not soften, but he did raise an eyebrow at the term. "Grasping?" he echoed, disbelief evident in his voice. "Indeed," Christopher replied with a wry smile. "Your ambition is almost as unapologetic as mine, though admittedly, I've been more successful. It might look different when one of the realm's greatest lords pursues it, but I recognize it for what it is. Let's not pretend your entry into this war was by mere happenstance." Tywin's gaze hardened, but a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He rolled his eyes slightly, his patience wearing thin. "You wished to discuss the future, not engage in childish banter. I am more interested in substance than in your attempts at provocation." Christopher's smile remained, though his tone took on a sharper edge. "Very well, Lord Tywin." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air. "You are aware that you will not face execution. But perhaps it will surprise you to learn that Sir Jaime will not be executed either." Tywin's previously impassive face showed the first signs of reaction when Christopher mentioned Jaime. "He will still wear the white cloak after committing regicide?" Tywin's voice was tinged with disbelief, his stoic demeanor cracking just enough to reveal his concern. "No," Christopher clarified, "Sir Jaime will lose his white cloak, but he will be pardoned in exchange for your cooperation, reparations, and concessions." Tywin's eyes, usually so unreadable, flickered with a glint of interest. The notion of Jaime's future was clearly a significant factor in his considerations. Christopher, having studied Tywin's priorities, was keenly aware that the Lannister patriarch's greatest concern was his legacy. This legacy was threatened by the Kingsguard vow binding Jaime Lannister and the presence of his son Tyrion, whom Tywin openly despised. Christopher recognized that while he could weaken Tywin's position, outright destruction was not possible. Instead, compromise and negotiation were crucial to achieving a stable resolution. "I am sure the terms will be generous," Tywin commented, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Christopher tilted his head slightly, unfazed. "That remains to be seen, Lord Tywin. It will depend on your cooperation and will be finalized at the end of this rebellion." Tywin fell silent, clearly lost in thought. Christopher took this as his cue to rise from his seat. "It has been a pleasure, Lord Tywin. I will not detain you further." As Christopher departed, he could almost feel Tywin's unspoken apprehension about what further demands might be forthcoming, particularly concerning Sir Jaime. Though Tywin remained outwardly silent, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as Christopher left the room. Christopher knew Tywin might be bracing for a harsher blow, perhaps fearing that he would exact a brutal punishment on Jaime, maybe even maiming or castrating him out of spite to deny Tywin an heir. He had other plans in mind, however. Christopher was confident that his own terms would be more than satisfactory for his own goals. To Christopher, Sir Jaime's fate was inconsequential. His only focus was leveraging the Lannisters to secure control over the keys and resources of the Westerlands. Jaime's life mattered little to him beyond the fact that he had betrayed a corrupt and tyrannical king. For Tywin, however, the stakes were far higher. In the end, Tywin would regain his prized heir, but Christopher was determined to ensure it came at a considerable cost. The Rains of Storm's End. Sarah picked idly at her food as they broke their fast, the loud voice of Robert Baratheon fading into the background as she stared listlessly at the cold ham and bread on her plate. The weight of the past week hung heavily on her shoulders, and the once familiar comfort of Harrenhal had been replaced by an anxious tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the castle. A nudge at her side startled her, and she looked up to see her mother's disapproving stare. Sarah instinctively straightened, a reflex born from years of trying to avoid that very look. It was a habit ingrained in her from childhood, where every misstep or slouch had been met with her mother's quiet, yet cutting, displeasure. She glanced around the table, hoping no one else had noticed her lapse. Her brother, seated on her other side, gave her a sympathetic look, but she ignored it. Her focus drifted past her father, who sat in somber silence, to where Robert Baratheon held court with his lords, his booming voice filling the hall. In the week since the rebel king's arrival at Harrenhal, the castle had transformed from a place of sorrow and somber reflection to one of restless anxiety. Though Robert had acknowledged the loss of 3 family members at the Trident, it seemed to matter little in the face of his demands for more support in the ongoing struggle. Her father had tried to reason with him, explaining that their current levies and men-at-arms were crucial to hold the vast fortress, which could be taken with far fewer forces than it should require. But Robert remained insistent, unmoved by such arguments. Just a day after his arrival, the first of the Stormlords had appeared. Lord Gullian Swan had reaffirmed his unwavering loyalty to Robert, recounting his narrow escape with a few hundred men. The once vibrant grounds that had hosted the tourney now bore the grim presence of a military encampment, with tents and soldiers replacing the laughter and festivities. It had been at Lord Gullian's suggestion that Robert take her youngest brother as a squire, a gesture meant to ensure House Went's representation and allegiance to the rebel cause. Her parents, though clearly reluctant, had been powerless to refuse, especially when 2 more Stormlords arrived the next day with nearly 2,000 men between them. The Marcher Lord Brian Carron, a towering and formidable figure, made it clear that any hint of treason would be met with swift and brutal retribution. He had bluntly stated that should her family fail to contribute to the cause, he would not hesitate to put the castle, and everyone within it, to the sword. And finally, there was Lord Glendon Fell, known as Silveraxe, a younger man who had originally fought for the Royalists under his father's command. When the Royalist Stormlords were defeated at the battles at Summerhall, Lord Fell was killed in the fighting, and the then Sir Glendon had swiftly switched cloaks, aligning himself with the rebels. This act of opportunism did not particularly concern Sarah, but the man's newfound interest in her did. As she glanced up from her plate, her eyes met Lord Glendon's across the hall. His gaze lingered on her, a small smile playing on his lips, one laced with amusement and something far less innocent. The attention made her skin crawl, a shiver she had to consciously suppress as she looked away. Sarah was only thankful that her parents had already conceded to making Simond Robert Baratheon's squire. Otherwise, she dreaded to think what alternative Lord Glendon might have suggested. His interest in her was unmistakable, and the thought of what that could mean filled her with a deep, unsettling dread. "Lady Sarah, is it not?" Robert Baratheon's booming voice cut through the din of the hall. Her heart sank as she realized that now the entire table's attention, especially the Stormlords, was fixed on her. A quick glance at her parents did nothing to calm her nerves. Her mother's face was stony, while her father's wide eyes betrayed his apprehension. "Yes, it is, my king," Sarah corrected herself quickly, nodding toward Robert. She remembered him from the tourney, though he was still as handsome as she recalled, there was a bitterness in him now, an unpleasant glint in his eyes that had not been there before. It was clear that his defeat still gnawed at him. "I remember you from Robert began, but his words trailed off, the mood in the hall suddenly tense as the storm lords around him grimaced. "I did wonder if you had any betrothals arranged." This time, his gaze shifted to include her parents. Before her father could respond, her mother spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "I am afraid that we have already negotiated with Lord Piper for his heir, Mark." Sarah struggled to mask her surprise at her mother's bold-faced lie. If she hadn't known of Lord Clement and his son Mark, she might have almost believed the betrothal had been arranged without her knowledge. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Lord Piper." He trailed off, clearly struggling to recall the name. But before he could dwell on it, Lord Brian Caron, unfortunately, seemed to have a better memory. "Lord Clement?" Lord Caron asked, his tone sharp. When her mother nodded, though hesitantly, the Marcher Lord's eyes narrowed with obvious distrust. Sarah's stomach churned as the man leaned forward slightly, a calculating glint in his gaze. Is his son not 6 name-days old? The lie seemed poised to unravel, but her mother didn't miss a beat. "We wish to be tied to loyal Riverlords," she replied smoothly. "And with Lord Darry and Lord Ruger's betrayal, there are unfortunately few suitable options left." Robert seemed satisfied with this explanation, nodding slowly. Lord Glendenfell remained emotionless, while Lord Brian still looked unconvinced, his eyes flicking suspiciously between Sarah and her mother. Just as Sarah braced herself for more probing questions, they were interrupted by the sudden arrival of a breathless Baratheon man-at-arms. "My king, apologies for the interruption, but a host has been spotted on the horizon, bearing Tully banners." Sarah's attention snapped to Robert Baratheon, who leapt from his chair with such force that the wooden seat nearly toppled over. "Finally, Lord Hoster has arrived. We strike our tents and ride to join Lord John immediately," Robert declared, his voice echoing through the hall. The Stormlords rose with him, as did her parents, all moving with a renewed sense of urgency. "My king," her father began, only to be cut off by Robert's brisk command. "Come, boy. I'll need my armor now." Robert strode toward the door without a second glance, and after a moment's hesitation, her brother scrambled to follow, casting a quick, anxious look back at Sarah and their parents. Her parents hurried after Robert, accompanied by Lords Caron and Swan. Sarah, still seated, found herself momentarily stunned by the sudden shift in atmosphere. She was startled out of her thoughts by a voice from across the table. "I recall you dancing with Christopher Mudd," Lord Glendenfell sneered, spitting out Christopher's name as though it were poison on his tongue. "Your mother wasn't lying about a betrothal, just who it was with." His eyes gleamed with something dark as he leaned back in his chair, twirling a dagger between his fingers with a lazy, practiced ease. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She kept her silence, her thoughts racing as she calculated how quickly she could call for the guards if the situation escalated. Despite the fear, she couldn't help the flicker of happiness at the idea that her suspicions about a betrothal to Christopher might have been true. Lord Glendon didn't miss the fleeting expression, and his smirk deepened, clearly taking her reaction as confirmation of what he already suspected. "Don't worry," Glendon continued, his smirk growing more arrogant. "I'll free you from that obligation, whether in battle or when we take King's Landing." His voice dripped with malice as he rose from his seat, the dagger still spinning in his hand. "Wherever that traitorous cockroach hides," Lord Glendon concluded, his voice a low, menacing rumble. He lingered for a moment, his gaze locking onto hers as he rose to his feet. The dagger he'd been twirling came to a stop, the blade glinting in the dim light of the hall. "When we wed, I'll want you clad in green." With a final, arrogant smirk, Lord Fell turned and strode out of the hall, leaving her seated in stunned silence. The hall seemed to close in around her, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. She didn't truly exhale until several minutes had passed, her breath coming in hurried, shallow gasps as her heart raced with fear. Sarah felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Why was Lord Fell so confident in their victory? Hadn't the momentum shifted? Did the rebels have some devious trick they planned to spring on the royalists, or was it just empty bravado? Maybe she should warn Christopher. The thought brought a small measure of clarity, a sense of purpose amidst the chaos swirling in her mind. It seemed prudent, not only for his sake but to ease the pressure that had been building up inside her ever since Robert Baratheon and his Stormlords had arrived. Tytos Blackwood paced the length of his new quarters, a surprisingly comfortable prison cell. The accommodations exceeded his expectations, and he attributed this unexpected luxury to the man holding him captive, a man he hadn't seen in years but one he remembered vividly. The idea of Sir Christopher Mudd as Hand of the King was as unfathomable as Lord Mace Tyrell abandoning the Siege of Storm's End to ambush them. Yet both had come to pass. He remembered the tourney, where he had seen Christopher as a minor figure, someone to perhaps curry favor with for future gains in the Riverlands. The notion that Christopher might one day overshadow him had been inconceivable. But now, Tytos found himself grappling with a dramatic reversal of fortune. Christopher had outmaneuvered them all. Initially, the camp had dismissed the news of the Knight's rise as a desperate joke, with the Targaryens allegedly thrusting the hand's pin onto the nearest available cloak. Many of those who had laughed likely met their end on the King's Road, felled by Reachman arrows or crushed beneath Tyrell cavalry. Lord Tywin Lannister, once ridiculed for his late arrival and defeat at Christopher's hands at King's Landing, had perhaps made the wisest choice by lowering his banners and surrendering when he recognized the situation had turned hopeless. It had kept him his head and life, something that many of those who mocked him did not possess any longer. Tytos had narrowly survived the battle himself. He had not joined in the mocking, mostly led by the Stormlanders. Instead, he had been shocked but not entirely surprised. He knew of Christopher's capabilities, a far cry from the insignificant knight many had dismissed him as. The Blackfish's rearguard had been slaughtered to a man when the Crackclaw host arrived, sacrificing their lives for the rest of the army. Some Stormlords and their men had fled into the fields, only to be pursued by Reachman cavalry. A few had escaped, but Tytos and his closest men had laid down their arms to Mathis Rowan's forces. Lord Rowan, to his credit, had ensured that those who surrendered were spared and treated with a measure of decency. As Tytos was led in chains past the thousands of bodies now strewn across the battlefield, he found himself grateful that he had persuaded Edwin to remain at Raventree Hall to care for Alysanne and Jamis. The thought of losing any of them was unbearable, never mind his wife or newborn son. Tytos halted his pacing, suppressing a shiver as that unsettling thought crossed his mind. A knock at the door mercifully interrupted his dark musings. "Enter," Tytos commanded with a touch of authority. Despite his captivity, he was still a lord and would not allow himself to appear meek or defeated. The door opened, revealing the very man Tytos had expected. Sir Christopher Mudd was still recognizable, but much had changed. He now wore a resplendent brown doublet with golden embroidery, a crown of gold stitched over his chest adorned with emeralds, a reflection of his house's sigil. A flowing burgundy cloak, lined with fur and fastened with a gilded brooch depicting a clenched hand, completed his attire. His dark leather boots were polished for shine. The golden brooch especially caught Tytos' eye. Any lingering doubts he might have had about Christopher's position as Hand of the King were dispelled at that moment. "Lord Hand, I suppose," Tytos finally greeted him. Christopher's green-blue eyes betrayed little as he strode into the room with a measured, confident step. "Indeed, Lord Tytos, though I recall we once agreed to forego titles in private. I hope this war hasn't soured our friendship?" Christopher hinted with a small, teasing grin and a raised eyebrow. Tytos was caught off guard by the ease with which Christopher seemed willing to overlook the sides they had taken in the conflict. It either spoke to the depth of Christopher's regard for their friendship or suggested he had ulterior motives. The guarded look in Christopher's eyes made Tytos lean toward the latter. "Very well, Christopher. We did make that promise, Tytos replied, probing for a clearer understanding of his former friend's intentions. Though if you would drop the mask you wear, I would appreciate it. Christopher tilted his head slightly, amusement and mirth flickering in his eyes. I suppose you would catch that. While we are not the closest of friends, I do not consider you a mere acquaintance, Tytos. I suppose we are not, Tytos conceded. They had gotten along well, that was true. Yet we are not in the same circumstances as we were in once, he said as he gestured to the room around him. Christopher followed his gaze, nodding slightly. No, we are not. But it doesn't have to remain this way. Tytos recognized an offer when he heard one. Oh? Indeed. All I ask is for your cooperation and support in my future endeavors, Christopher replied, his gaze locking onto Tytos with intent. Tytos narrowed his eyes, wary of what those endeavors might entail. And what might those be? House Tully's time as lords of the Riverlands will come to an end with this rebellion. They have overreached, presenting a unique opportunity for someone to exploit their greed and misfortune. Christopher's tone was measured but carried the weight of a man who had thought long and hard about this. Tytos blinked, struggling to process what Christopher was suggesting. Was he truly planning to usurp House Tully, the lords of River Run, since the fall of Christopher IV? The irony was not lost on him, the idea that Christopher, a descendant and namesake of the ancient Mudds, might seek to resurrect his house by ending the Tully's reign. It was almost poetic. Lord Hoster is said to be leading the remaining Riverlords into the next battle, Christopher continued, his voice firm with resolve. I will ensure that House Tully is reduced to a boy lord and his two sisters. Edmure will foster under me, while his sisters will renounce any claims of theirs and their future children before the realm in King's Landing. I'll hold River Run until Old Stones is rebuilt and fit to be the seat of House Mudd once more. Then, House Mudd will hold both castles in perpetuity. The certainty in Christopher's voice was so absolute that, for a moment, Tytos almost believed it was already a reality. This will happen, Christopher stated, his tone brooking no argument. What I ask of you, Tytos, is your support. Stand with me when the other Riverlords protest or rise against me, however bold they might feel. Tytos blinked again, incredulous. You think I alone can help you keep River Run and secure the Riverlands? There was disbelief in his voice, bordering on concern. Had Christopher lost his senses? Was this some delusion born of power? Christopher shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. Of course not, my friend. I'm already in talks with Lord Went about a marriage to his daughter. Lords Ruger, Darry, and Mutin are Targaryen loyalists. They will be grateful when I break the sieges pinning them down. And even if they're not, they'll follow the commands of the crown. You are the crown, Tytos pointed out, glancing at the gleaming brooch on Christopher's chest. Christopher's grin widened, revealing a hint of the boy he once was. Precisely. Tytos remained silent for a few moments, his mind turning over the implications of Christopher's offer, searching for any potential pitfalls. Finally, he spoke. And what do I stand to gain from this alliance? Christopher's eyes gleamed, sensing the shift in the conversation. Now you're asking the right questions. He paused, then regarded Tytos with a calculating gaze. First, you'll be released immediately. I imagine even these quarters, comfortable as they are, hold little appeal for a man of your station. My uncle might have endured this for years without complaint, but nobles have different priorities, he added, the remark carrying an edge. Tytos dismissed the barb with a slight nod. And? You'll have my favor as Lord Paramount. More importantly, I foresee that Lord Bracken, feeling slighted by your rise, will eventually overstep. When that time comes, would you not wish to be the first Blackwood to hold dominion over Stonehenge? The thought struck deep. The rivalry between Blackwood and Bracken was as old as the hills, and the idea of finally bringing Stonehenge under his house's control was tantalizing. The vision of his brother or son ruling over those lands filled him with a satisfaction he was almost embarrassed to admit. You would alienate one of your more prominent lords to aid me? House Bracken is more popular in the Riverlands than Blackwood. Their allies wouldn't stand idly by. Our forces are evenly matched, and their cavalry is renowned for a reason. Tytos found himself almost defending his rival as if testing Christopher's resolve. Christopher's lips curled into a faint smile, recognizing the irony. House Tully survived as lords paramount by maintaining a careful balance. They made sure not to draw the ire of any of their vassals, but neither did they inspire love. I intend to do as my ancestors did, fostering loyalty among my vassals and dealing with those who stand in my way. Tytos considered this approach. It was risky, but it could pay off by creating a core of fiercely loyal followers. Still, there was the danger of alienating too many powerful houses. It could easily blow up in Christopher's face. It won't be as simple as just revoking their holdings. Even I would rise up against such tyrannical actions, Tytos warned, his expression serious. Of course. If I saw the king revoke Lord Lannister's lands without just cause, I would do the same, Christopher replied smoothly. But opportunities will arise, and when they do, I will act decisively. I won't be as merciful as I must be in the immediate aftermath of this war. Tytos could see the sense in that. Christopher's rise from an unlanded knight to Lord Paramount would already be seen as an extraordinary move. He'd have to tread carefully in the short term, but the long game was clearly in his mind. His eyes narrowed at Christopher's final words. You expect someone will rise against you, then? Christopher shrugged, his expression unreadable. These are hypotheticals for now, but I must consider every possibility. So, have you made your decision? I can't talk here indefinitely. Tytos grew thoughtful, weighing his options. What choice did he really have? Christopher seemed poised for victory, the rebels' forces were weakened, and the numbers were on the royalist side. It was a gamble, but the odds seemed in his favor. And if Christopher fell, Tytos could always claim he'd been forced into compliance or paid his ransom. After a few long moments, Tytos finally nodded. Very well. I'll support you as Lord Paramount, but I want your word that Stonehenge will belong to House Blackwood. Christopher's face brightened with satisfaction. I am a man of my word, Tytos, and I promise you that within my lifetime, Stonehenge will be under Blackwood control. They clasped hands, sealing the agreement. My lord, Tytos said, his voice carrying the weight of the commitment he had just made. As their hands parted, he couldn't help but imagine a future where House Bracken lay broken, their lands under Blackwood rule, a future where this handshake was remembered as the moment that turned the tide. Prince Oberyn sat astride his fierce sand steed with an ease that belied the countless hours of practice he had endured in his youth to perfect the appearance of effortlessness. Oberyn was well aware of the fortune bestowed upon him. His striking looks and his well-formed body were assets he never took for granted. His elder brother, Doran, was 10 years his senior, and unlike many other second sons, Oberyn had never once considered challenging him for the title of Prince of Dorne. He loved Doran and believed that his brother was well suited to lead their homeland. Doran embodied the opportunistic and calculating nature of Dorne, traits that Oberyn respected but did not share. Instead, he had chosen to represent Dorne's passion, fiery spirit, and untamed heart. The two brothers complemented each other's strengths and weaknesses when they sought the same goal. However, it was unfortunate that they so rarely agreed on what that goal should be. When Doran had forbidden Oberyn from leading their 10,000 men north to fight alongside their uncle, Oberyn had been furious. But when the news reached them of the defeat at the Trident and the death of Uncle Lewin, his emotions were conflicted. He believed that, had he been there, things might have gone differently. Yet a small part of him was also relieved that he had not been involved. Instead, Oberyn had been stationed at Ironwood with the remaining army, ready to confront any force, royalist or rebel, that might attempt to invade Dorne through the Boneway. When a letter arrived from Doran, explaining the appointment of the new Hand of the King and the order signed by their sister, Oberyn's feelings were mixed. He was pleased at the prospect of finally marching into action but enraged that this new hand dared to wield their sister's captivity in King's Landing as a threat. The fact that the new hand was Sir Christopher, the melee champion at Harrenhal, only deepened Oberon's disdain. He had tried to provoke the younger man, hoping to strip away his facade of humility, which Oberon found insufferably false. But his attempts had been thwarted by his sister, ironically enough, who had grown tired of that evening's tension. Reluctantly, Oberon had to concede that Christopher's strategy was sound. It promised the action he craved and, from a tactical standpoint, was wise. His time at the Citadel had provided him with a solid foundation in strategy and the study of historical military campaigns. Although he knew he would always be more of a warrior than a strategist, Oberon was not one to discount the knowledge he possessed. At Blackhaven, they rendezvoused with Lord Franklin Fowler and Lady Blackmont's husband, both of whom had defended the Prince's Pass to Dawn from Lord Fowler's seat at Skyreach. It was there that Oberon encountered an astonishing revelation. On the third day of their march up the Prince's Pass, Lord Fowler and his men had stumbled upon a tower that Fowler claimed had always been abandoned in previous years. To their surprise, it was now inhabited. Inside, they found 3 Kingsguard knights and a heavily pregnant Lady Lyanna Stark. The so-called abducted lady who had ignited this entire war was revealed to be Prince Rhaegar's second wife. The sheer disrespect to his sister, Elia, almost made Oberon want to seek out Rhaegar's body and kill him again, if such a thing were possible. Lady Lyanna was sent to Skyreach under the escort of 100 Fowler men and Sir Arthur Dane, who insisted on remaining close to her. Meanwhile, the 2 other Kingsguard, Lord Commander Gerald Hightower and Sir Oswell Went, joined the Fowler and Blackmont host to march on Storm's End. They planned to return to King's Landing and the young king after hearing of King Aerys' death and the new hand's actions. Oberon found their decision somewhat foolish. Why choose to protect the child after they had already abandoned the boy for over a year? However, he did not prevent them from continuing with their plans. Both knights were formidable warriors, and their presence could prove valuable in the assault. The rest of the journey through the lands of the Marcher Lords, historically the greatest obstacle to any Dornish host attempting to take this very path, was uneventful by comparison. Blackhaven, seat of House Dundarian, and Harvest Hall, stronghold of House Selmy, both castles where many a Martell and Dornish warrior before him had fought and lost their lives against the Durrandons, Baratheons, and Targaryens, were now nearly deserted. Each held only a paltry garrison, with no force capable of challenging their advance. Oberon had felt a temptation to exploit this weakness, if only as a nod to the history of failed Dornish forays into the Stormlands. However, he knew that doing so would delay their progress for little tangible gain. The true prize lay ahead, the fall of Storm's End. Taking the ancient stronghold would be a triumph akin to claiming the maidenhood of a woman, something never before accomplished by anyone before. That was a victory worth pursuing. The castle was as formidable as its reputation, its massive walls standing defiantly against the encroaching darkness of the storm clouds gathering over the glittering bay to the east. Oberon could only hope those clouds were not headed in their direction. He had never witnessed a Stormlands storm before, and while the experience might be intriguing, he had no desire to endure one during an assault. As they approached, the plains before the castle unfolded, revealing a sprawling expanse of tents and fluttering banners. The red and black of the Targaryen dragon was unmistakable, boldly proclaiming the allegiance of the assembled forces. Yet what caught Oberon's eye were the banners emblazoned with green apples, the sigil of House Fossaway. He couldn't recall which seat this particular branch of the family held, only that the other branch bore red apples on their banners. From the camp, a small party of riders made their way toward them. At the head of the group was presumably the Fossaway Lord himself. Oberon halted his mount and raised a hand in greeting as they approached within speaking distance. He knew that one branch of House Fossaway were the original lords, while the other branch were landed knights. If this green-appled Fossaway was leading the army, he wondered about the distinction. Lord Fossaway, Oberon greeted with a charismatic smile, hoping to clarify any potential misconceptions about the man's rank. Sir John Fossaway, at your service, Prince Oberon. The powerfully built knight responded firmly. Gods damn it. Indeed, you command this siege and the men? Oberon asked, his gaze shifting beyond Sir John to the encampment. Sir John nodded. I do. I understand you and your men are here to reinforce me as we prepare to storm the castle? Oberyn caught the underlying question in the knight's words. Will you follow my lead? We only wish to see the Targaryen and Martell banners flying from those walls, sir, Oberyn replied diplomatically. If you have a plan, we shall support it. Good, Sir John Fossaway said with a faint smile. He turned his gaze toward the darkening clouds. I want to assault the castle before that storm arrives. If we wait, the rains will turn the ground to mud, making it impossible to launch a coordinated attack. He then turned back to Oberyn. Oberyn glanced to his sides and saw that his brother's bannermen had joined him, Lord Franklin Fowler, Lord Harmon Uller, Lord Dagos Manwoody, and Lord Quentin Corgyle. Each of these men was a capable warrior, though their skills varied. Lord Dagos, in particular, was renowned for his deadly prowess, a man even Oberyn would approach with caution. None of the lords seemed to object to the plan. Oberyn turned back to Sir John. It seems sensible, but do we have any idea how soon the storm will arrive? Sir John's expression grew slightly apprehensive. He turned to one of his companions, an Ambrose knight marked by red ants on a yellow surcoat. The knight shrugged, and Sir John shook his head as he turned back. It appears the storm is still some distance away. We'll launch the assault as soon as your men have set up camp and armed themselves. Oberyn nodded. I suppose only the gods can truly predict the weather. Or a Stormlander, came a muttered remark from one of the lords by his side. Oberyn couldn't pinpoint who spoke, but he agreed. If anyone could predict the fickle nature of these lands' weather, it would be the Stormlanders themselves. Such speculation was moot, however. Within the hour, they had set up their tents, secured their supplies, and readied their arms and ladders. The air was charged with anticipation as trumpets sounded the advance. Oberyn moved with the ladder-bearers, Sir Oswell went in his white cloak at his side. He could see that the clouds were closing in faster now and thought he glimpsed a flash of lightning in the distance. Shaking off the distraction, he focused on the task at hand, raising his shield in one hand and gripping his spear in the other. Oberyn knew it would be unwise to approach the walls without his shield, even though it didn't match his preference for the spear. The shield was a smart precaution against arrows. Once he was on the walls, he could cast it aside and focus on using his spear to its full potential. All denizens of Storm's End could recognize the signs if they had lived within its ancient walls for any length of time. Stannis Baratheon had learned them from his father, who had inherited them from his forebears. The humid tang in the air, the escalating fury of waves smashing against the bay, the subtle shift in the wind, all pointed to the approach of one of the infamous storms that had earned the castle its name. Standing upon the colossal battlements that had weathered countless storms and repelled numerous assaults, Stannis gazed out over the churning waters. The skies above were a tumult of overcast clouds, dark and brooding. The storm seemed distant, but Stannis knew better than to trust appearances. Far too many Stormlanders throughout history had met their end underestimating the ferocity of such gales, and the speed they moved. He turned his gaze westward, where the sight that greeted him was more infuriating than any storm. The plains, where he had once learned to ride, were now a chaotic expanse of tents, campfires, and flapping banners. The familiar greens and blues of the rear clods had been joined by new colors, orange, yellow, and red, blending together in a defiant patchwork that stained the landscape like a festering wound. The Stormland's greatest enemies, united in a bitter irony, had come to besiege the heart of his ancestral lands. For centuries before the conquest, the Stormlands, Reach, and Dawn had been locked in a relentless cycle of conflict, the old enmities as much a part of the landscape as the hills and rivers. Yet now, the banner of the Conqueror flew above both his enemies, as they closed in on Storm's End. Stannis had realized the tide was turning when Lord Mace Tyrell withdrew with all but 5,000 men. For over a year, Storm's End had withstood the Tyrell siege and the Redwyne blockade, first through sheer determination and loyalty to his brother Robert, then by consuming the horses, cats, and rats that shared the castle with them. Their salvation had come in the form of a smuggler, who risked everything to slip through the red wine fleet, delivering a shipload of onions and salted fish that had kept them alive. Before the smugglers' arrival, desperation had nearly driven the garrison to collapse. Sir Gawain Wilde, the castle's master-at-arms, along with 3 knights, had been caught trying to defect. In his fury, Stannis had intended to launch the traitors toward their besiegers by catapult, but Maester Cressin had intervened, urging restraint. He warned that they might yet need those men if their food supply dwindled to nothing. Reluctantly, Stannis heeded the advice and confined the 4 men in the dungeons. Yet the dire scarcity of provisions meant they could not spare even a morsel for the prisoners. Sir Gawain had already succumbed to malnutrition, a grim harbinger of what awaited the rest if relief did not come. Stannis had rationed and re-rationed, stretching their meager supplies to the breaking point, but the siege dragged on, relentless as the storms battering the castle walls. Now, however, it seemed the siege would soon conclude, one way or another. His men were weak from malnutrition, even with the critical supplies brought by Davos, the smuggler. They had to consume the provisions sparingly, for too much at once would only lead to sickness, leaving them weaker than before. The garrison was fierce and driven, but Stannis knew the odds were stacked against them. The besiegers' ranks had swelled with the arrival of the Martells and their Dornish forces, when Lord Mace Tyrell and the bulk of the Reach host had inexplicably abandoned the siege. Stannis had briefly considered a sally. Yet with their numbers only a fraction of the besiegers, barely a tenth, and of those, perhaps half truly fit for combat, such a move would have hastened the fall of Storm's End. The new commander, Sir Jon Fossaway, was no fool either. Early in the siege, when their strength had been more substantial, Stannis had led a small raid when Lord Mace led the rear Claudes, hoping to disrupt the enemy lines. The effort had yielded little damage and cost the lives of too many good men, quelling any thoughts of a repeat attempt. Now, as the thousands of besiegers marched toward his ancestral home, they did so with an unnerving determination. They seemed unfazed by the approaching storm, as if oblivious to the fury that nature was about to unleash, which they probably were when he thought about it. Stannis couldn't see a way to turn the approaching storm to his advantage. Stormlanders were adept at reading the signs of an impending tempest, but that knowledge only served to tell them when to seek shelter. Now, as their besiegers prepared to assault the walls, his men would be forced to stand exposed, battling both the elements and the enemy. As the attackers closed in beneath the walls, his men began rushing past him, a flurry of activity as they prepared for the onslaught. Stannis had sacrificed every piece of furniture he could spare to heat cauldrons of sand and dirt in the castle's courtyards, a desperate measure for desperate times. Now, those cauldrons were finally being put to use. His men hurried past, bearing the heavy, heated metal between them with wooden poles, their faces grim but determined. Over the clamor of rushing men, Stannis heard the unmistakable sound of wood scraping against stone as the besiegers raised their ladders to the crenellations. He risked a quick glance over the side, only to curse himself as an arrow whizzed past, sent in his direction. It wasn't close to striking him, but he cursed his foolishness regardless. There was no room for such carelessness, not now, not with everything hanging in the balance. Ladders here! His men shouted from various points along the battlements. In response, the awaiting soldiers rushed to the threatened sections, hoisting the heated cauldrons. At the command of their nearby men, they tipped them over the merlins, sending the scalding sand and dirt cascading down onto the ladders below. Stannis couldn't see the results, but the screams of agony and terror from the men climbing the ladders told him enough. Yet even as he listened, he noticed some of his men continuing to pour the precious mixture over the sides, heedless of the rapidly diminishing supply. "Raise the cauldrons. Don't waste it all now," Stannis barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The men quickly obeyed, but he knew it was already too late to recover what had been lost. Every resource was precious, and they could ill afford such waste. He glanced over at the nearest cauldron and saw that it was already half empty. They hadn't been able to fill them to the top, constrained by both the weight and the time required to heat the contents to a satisfactory temperature. Now, seeing the dwindling supply, Stannis felt a surge of frustration. Ladders. The cry rang out again, louder and more urgent. The besiegers had not given up, as Stannis had expected. He knew it was only a matter of time before they successfully scaled the walls. This was a battle of attrition, and the enemy had the upper hand. His men hurried to tip the cauldrons once more, and the air was soon filled with the familiar, haunting mix of agonized screams. But this time, Stannis also heard 2 heavy crashes and a string of curses. Snapping his gaze in that direction, he saw 2 cauldrons toppling over the edge, still half full. Fury surged within him, but he held it in check. If they weren't so desperate for every man capable of wielding a sword, he would have had their heads himself. Instead, he allowed the nearest soldiers to berate the offenders before barking at them to refocus on the battle. There was no time for mistakes, no margin for error. Every second, every drop of their dwindling resources, mattered. Throw stones and anything else you can find instead. Stannis ordered the men who had lost their cauldrons. That had always been the plan once the cauldrons were empty, but it made his blood boil that they had wasted the precious mixture so early. Now, only 4 cauldrons remained, and he could see the strain in his men as they rushed from ladder to ladder, their exhaustion growing with each trip. He ordered fresh men to take over, but the labor was grueling, and even the replacements soon began to tire. Another cauldron toppled over the side, and Stannis watched in frustration as the last of the cauldrons were emptied. With no more liquid to hurl, he ordered his men to cast the empty cauldrons over the battlements as well. Nearly an hour had passed since the first ladders had reached the walls, and now Stannis felt the first drop of rain hit his nose. The storm had arrived, and they had exhausted their resources. They had thrown everything they could find, stones, barrels, and even the blacksmith's anvil, which 4 men had heaved over with a mighty effort. Every piece of furniture that could be spared had been used as a projectile. The first raindrop was soon joined by another, and then another, until the drizzle became a steady, relentless pour. Stannis looked up, seeing the dark, menacing skies just off the coast. He could even discern the advancing wall of rain as it closed in. Within the next 5 minutes, the torrential downpour engulfed them, turning the battlefield into a drenched and chaotic scene. The attackers had finally managed to scale the ladders, and the initial resistance of Stannis's men had been overwhelmed. The Reachmen and Dornish began establishing footholds on the battlements as the rain poured down almost oppressively, making the wooden ladders increasingly treacherous. A few climbers lost their grip and slipped from the ladders, their screams abruptly cut off as they plunged to the ground below. One entire ladder, now slick with rain and mud, toppled, sending a score of men crashing down. Stannis's own forces were not spared from the chaos. He watched as at least 5 of his men either lost their footing or were pushed over the edge, falling into the courtyard below. The storm was no ally to either side, it only deepened the turmoil of the battle. Stannis had managed to cut down a few men at arms with his sword, but he knew his own weakness and malnutrition were taking their toll. The attackers, well-fed and provisioned, had a significant advantage. Even if the numbers had been equal, the attackers' full stomachs alone would have given them a crucial edge. Most of the attackers so far had been ordinary men at arms and minor knights, eager for the glory of being the first to breach the castle. But 2 figures stood out amidst the chaos. One, wielding a spear with a mastery that suggested he was born to it, cut through Stannis's men with deadly precision. This was presumably Prince Oberyn Martell himself. Stannis cursed their lack of arrows. The Dornish prince was a tantalizing target as he danced through the fray in his light armor, his spear an extension of his lethal grace. The other figure, however, was faring far worse. Clad in the white cloak of the Kingsguard and encased in heavy armor, Sir Oswell Went, if Stannis guessed correctly, was struggling against the slick, treacherous stones. The knight cut down any who dared challenge him, but Stannis held back a few men, waiting for the moment when the knight would lose his footing. Fate was on their side. The heavily armored knight finally slipped on the wet stone. Though he managed to avoid falling off either side, he was left prone, struggling to regain his balance. Now, ours is the fury, Stannis roared, rallying his men to charge at the fallen knight. The white-cloaked figure fought valiantly, fending off a few of Stannis' men and deflecting some blows with his plate armor. But it was Stannis himself who seized the moment. With grim determination, he forced his sword between the knight's cuirass and helmet. Through the narrow eye slits of Sir Oswell's helm, Stannis saw first surprise, then the light slowly fade from the knight's brown eyes. The man's death throes were soon accompanied by another grim sight, one of Stannis' men skewered by Prince Oberyn's spear. From the direction of the attack, Stannis realized that the spear had been aimed at him. He couldn't afford to dwell on this for long. As the spear was withdrawn, Stannis scrambled back, leaving his sword embedded in Sir Oswell's neck. Within moments, half a dozen men had positioned themselves between Stannis and the fierce Dornish prince. Though the attackers were cut down almost as quickly as they arrived, their sacrifice brought Stannis precious moments to fall back. The battlements were now swarming with assailants. His own forces had dwindled to around 100. Stannis, surrounded by a small cadre of loyal men, shouted, "Men, follow me. We withdraw to the keep proper." He led them cautiously toward the wooden stairs descending into the courtyard below. At the top of the stairs, 5 men made a last stand, fending off the pursuing Reach men-at-arms. One of Stannis' men slipped and fell with a scream, but the remaining defenders continued their fight without hesitation. As Stannis and his remaining men descended into the courtyard, he glanced back at the battlements. His remaining forces fought valiantly but were few against the overwhelming numbers of their attackers. He watched in grim silence as more of his men were pushed off the walls, meeting their end below. In that moment, Stannis knew the castle was lost. He had sensed its doom with the arrival of the Dornish earlier in the day, but now it was sealed. As he faced the overwhelming tide of enemies, he couldn't help but wonder how his elder brother Robert would react. Robert would undoubtedly rage and rave, as was his nature. But would there be more to his reaction? Stannis pondered whether Robert would feel any sorrow for the fate of his true brothers. The bond between them had grown distant since the death of their parents, and Stannis knew they had never been particularly close. Would Robert be proud of Stannis for holding the castle for so long, defying their enemies in his name? Or would he curse his name for ultimately failing to withstand the onslaught? These were the thoughts of a younger brother, grappling with the weight of impending defeat. Yet, despite knowing them to be a distraction and irrelevant, Stannis couldn't help but dwell on them. "My lord," one of his men called out urgently. Stannis turned to see the man pointing to the stairs. The last of their defenders had fallen, and the assaulters were now pouring down the stairs like a relentless flood, much like the unyielding rain cascading over the castle. Storm's End had been built to defy the fury of the storm, but now it seemed destined to fall to the storm's might for the first time. Perhaps it was the legendary storm god having the final say against Stannis' Durrandon heritage, an ironic twist of fate that the very storm they had withstood so long would now bring their end. His men looked to him with weary, questioning eyes. What were their next steps? "To the keep," Stannis commanded, his voice resolute despite the grim circumstances. "We fight them for every inch. Let them know that House Baratheon did not fall meekly at Storm's End." The remaining men moved quickly towards the keep, pushing open the great oaken doors. Once inside, they shut and barred the doors, knowing they wouldn't hold indefinitely but hoping they would buy a little more time. As Stannis' thoughts wandered to the Maester's drum tower where Maester Cressin and his youngest brother, Renly, were taking refuge, his thoughts grew heavy. The fate of the castle's inhabitants now rested in the hands of Sir Jon Fossaway or Prince Oberyn Martell. He hesitated as the first blows struck the barred doors. Was he willing to sacrifice his only true family for the sake of stubborn defiance? Renly was innocent, yet if Stannis held out, they could withstand the attackers for no more than a day, assuming they didn't breach the keep today. Was this defiance worth the lives of every remaining soul in the castle? Stannis had been driven by duty to his elder brother, but that duty had already failed. Was he so desperate for a hint of Robert's approval that he would doom his younger brother in the process? Stannis knew that even if he surrendered, the besiegers might still kill Renly. But there was at least a chance of sparing him, a chance that would vanish if he continued to resist. In memory of his late mother, who would be heartbroken to lose all her sons, Stannis felt the weight of his decision more than ever. "Open the porthole," Stannis ordered sharply, his eyes locked onto one of his men. The remaining 10 looked at him with confusion, their weariness etched on their faces. He met their questioning gazes with a steely resolve. "You heard me correctly," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Are you sure, my lord?" one of the men asked, casting a glance at his comrades. Was it truly so surprising that Stannis would seek terms? They were a mere 10 against thousands, the battle was lost. "Of course I'm sure. Now open the damn hatch." Stannis's voice was fierce, a final display of authority. He would not have his orders questioned after all they had endured. The men hesitated, and Stannis, his frustration mounting, pushed past them to slide open the hatch himself. He peered out, seeing the enemy forces halting at the sight of him. "I seek terms, fetch your lord," Stannis declared firmly. The silence that followed was heavy before he heard the sound of men scrambling away. He quickly slid the hatch nearly closed, leaving just a sliver open to prevent anyone from looking in. Turning back to his men, he saw 2 already leaning wearily against the walls, their fighting spirit seemingly drained. "You have been the most loyal servants of House Baratheon," he said with deep respect. "And you have my eternal gratitude. Now, that service is at an end. I do not expect to live through this, nor do I expect any of you to." One of the men looked bewildered. "Then why not fight on, take at least one more of those bastards with us?" he asked, frustration evident in his voice. Stannis gave him a stern look, his tone steady but firm. "My brother Renly is still a boy. The battle is lost, but I won't condemn him to death if there's any way to prevent it." He shook his head, his resolve unshaken despite the grim circumstances. The men fell silent, their frustration giving way to a heavy, uncertain quiet. A knock echoed on the door, breaking the stillness. Stannis slid the hatch open once more. Through the narrow slit, he saw Sir Jon Fossaway standing alongside Prince Oberyn. "You seek terms?" Sir Jon Fossaway's voice was authoritative, cutting through the tension. Stannis cast a final, regretful glance at his men before nodding. "I do." For the first time in history, Storm's End had fallen to a foreign assault. This defeat would be Stannis's legacy, and he could only hope that it would, in some way, be worth the cost. "You said you wanted to talk about something?" Adam asked as he stepped into Christopher's solar, closing the door behind him. The chamber was dimly lit, its high stone walls bearing the weight of history through tapestries that told the tale of House Mudd's rise and fall. One tapestry depicted a crowned Mudd, a dozen lords kneeling in submission before him. Another showed the grim execution of King Roland II Arryn by the legendary Christopher IV, while a third captured the tragic fall of Christopher IV and the brief reign of his successor, Christopher V. A large hearth crackled on one side, casting a warm, flickering glow that danced across the room. Above the hearth hung the banner of House Mudd. The central table, cluttered with maps, scrolls, and tomes, showed glimpses of Christopher's diligent work. Christopher sat behind it in a carved, high-backed chair, looking up with a welcoming smile as Adam entered. "Yes, take a seat," Christopher gestured to the chair nearest to Adam. Adam settled into the chair, feeling the warmth of the hearth on his back as Christopher slid a letter across the table toward him. He hesitated for a moment, recognizing the handwriting before he began to skim through it. As his eyes moved over the words, he paused when the letter turned more personal. It seemed Christopher had indeed left an impression on Lady Sarah Went. After a moment, Adam set the letter down and met Christopher's gaze. "Robert Baratheon and his lords are confident," Adam said, noting the way Christopher sat, his fingers steepled together as he considered the news. "Indeed, the great Lord Glendon intends to marry my betrothed," Christopher quipped, though his eyes betrayed a hardness beneath the jest. "The Silveraxe himself," Adam replied with a smile he could barely contain, though it quickly faded into a more serious expression. "Still, it would be foolish to let your guard down. Greater warriors than you have been felled by lesser men than a lord, no matter how skilled they might be. Christopher's expression softened slightly as he nodded. "I'm well aware," he said quietly. "But for now, let's focus on the Dornish. Prince Oberyn should be arriving soon, and I need you with me when we greet him." Adam held his friend's gaze and gave a nod of agreement. They both rose from their seats and departed the solar. As they passed the door, Christopher gave a nod to one of the guards stationed there. Descending the tower, they made their way into the courtyard, where a small retinue of guards joined them. "Lord Hand," a voice called out. Christopher and Adam turned toward the sound. Standing by the entrance to the Red Keep was the portly figure of Lord Mace Tyrell. Christopher's eye twitched momentarily but was quickly replaced by a polite smile as he approached the Lord of the Reach. "Lord Tyrell," he said smoothly, "what brings you here today?" Lord Mace shifted slightly, his smile strained. "I was hoping we could speak in private," he said, casting a cautious glance around. "There are certain matters that need addressing, but they're best not discussed here." Christopher paused for a moment, then glanced toward the royal stables where horses were being readied. "I'm afraid I must attend to Prince Oberyn's arrival now," he said. "We'll need to schedule this discussion for another time." Lord Mace blinked and followed Christopher's gaze toward the stables. "Ah, I see, Lord Hand. I won't keep you any longer, then." With brief farewells, Christopher and Adam made their way to the stables. As Lord Mace turned back toward the keep, Adam leaned closer to Christopher and murmured, "He didn't seem like he was looking to discuss anything pleasant." Christopher glanced at him and nodded. "No, he did not." After a moment, his friend added, "Speculating now will only create unnecessary worry. Let's focus on the Dornish instead." The ride was mostly silent as they descended from the Red Keep and traveled along the Hook. The Dornish would be arriving from the south, needing to be ferried across the Rush to the river gate. As they crossed Fishmongers Square, they attracted many curious glances from merchants and fishers. Adam could hear snippets of conversation about Christopher as the crowd buzzed with gossip. They soon passed through the open portcullis of the river gate. It had been over a moon since such an opportunity had been possible, but with the siege finally lifted, some gates were now open to allow travel once again. Although heavily guarded, the gate permitted the small folk to enter and leave the city freely before nightfall. At the docks and wharfs, fishermen who had ventured into the bay that morning were returning, and the smell of fish and sea life filled the air, permeating the entire area. Across the Rush, Adam spotted a sizable cavalry force. It appeared that Prince Oberyn had brought only his cavalry to make swift time to King's Landing. At the piers, gold cloaks were busy organizing barges, fishing boats, and any other vessels available to ferry the men and horses across. The Blackwater Rush, known for its strong current, was particularly swift at its mouth, making the transportation a careful operation. Christopher, Adam, and the guards watched as the boats began their crossings. The first boat returned carrying about half a dozen men, and Adam noticed a grim trophy on a pike held by one of the boat's occupants. As the barge drew closer, he could see that the head was likely Stannis Baratheon's, the defending commander from the Siege of Storm's End and Robert Baratheon's brother. When the vessel bumped into the docks, Prince Oberyn was the first to leap off, clad in his distinctive armor. He was accompanied by Lord Commander Gerald Hightower and 2 other noble lords. The rest of the entourage consisted of men-at-arms, including the man carrying the pike with the trophy. "Sir Christopher, what a welcoming sight," Prince Oberyn said, his handsome face adorned with a polite but insincere smile. Adam noted how the Dornish prince pointedly ignored Christopher's position as Lord Hand and Regent. "Prince Oberyn, congratulations on the storming of Storm's End," Christopher replied with practiced diplomacy. "Witty," Oberyn remarked flatly, then gestured behind him. "Stannis Baratheon, or what's left of him." He pointed to the decaying head on a pike, its eyes plucked out by scavengers, making the sight grotesque. Then he turned to a smaller boy with the same black hair and blue eyes as Robert Baratheon, guarded by 2 men-at-arms. "And Renly Baratheon." Before Christopher could respond, Oberyn's gaze shifted past them toward the Red Keep. "I would like to see my sister now, if you don't mind." Does your hostage receive such privileges? Adam saw Christopher nearly roll his eyes. The Queen Mother is not a hostage, he replied, his tone measured. You don't need my permission, I assure you. Once, that might have been true, but no longer. While Christopher could benefit from Queen Elia and her children's presence, they were no longer hostages in the way they had been under Aerys. Oberyn didn't respond, brushing past them with a dismissive air. Renly Baratheon was taken with him, the boy casting a fearful glance up at Christopher and Adam before being led away. All but one of Oberyn's entourage followed, leaving Adam with a lingering sense of sorrow for Robert Baratheon's youngest brother. The lone figure remaining was Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, known as the White Bull. His sharp, wrinkled eyes locked onto Christopher. You are now Lord Hand, he began, raising a hand to halt Christopher's response. Prince Rhaegar trusted you, and according to rumors, it is you I should thank for the continued safety of the royal family. Christopher raised an eyebrow. If I'm not mistaken, those are your charges. Yet no white cloaks were seen in the city, except for a dirtied cloak found in the black cells. Lord Commander Gerald Hightower remained steadfast. Prince Rhaegar entrusted me and my brothers with the protection of another part of the family. Christopher glanced at Adam, his curiosity piqued. And who might that be? The prince's second wife, the pregnant Princess Lyanna, Gerald replied. Adam and Christopher exchanged a look of disbelief and surprise. Lyanna Stark? Adam finally managed to ask, his voice barely concealing his shock. The elder Kingsguard gave Adam a brief, expressionless glance, acknowledging him for the first time, but said nothing. He supposed there were not a lot of possible Lyannas, but still. Where is the princess now? Christopher asked. At Skyreach, Lord Fowler's seat, Gerald replied, along with Sir Arthur Dane. Christopher grew pensive, absorbing the weight of the information before asking, and what of Sir Oswell? Hightower's expression darkened. He fell during the assault on Storm's End. Christopher and Adam bowed their heads in respect. He was a good knight of the Kingsguard, Christopher said solemnly. They stood in silence for a few moments, honoring the fallen knight. Then, the Lord Commander looked intently at Christopher. He was indeed a fine member of the Kingsguard. Speaking of, I've heard you've appointed new members. Adam detected the subtle undertone in the older man's voice. Though the Lord Commander had been absent from the capital for over a year, his authority and pride in the Kingsguard were evident. Indeed, Christopher replied firmly. Sir Jeremy Rugger and Sir Valtrys Sunglass were chosen after proving their loyalty during the siege. The Lord Commander remained silent for a moment, glancing at Adam before turning his gaze back to Christopher. I will wish to evaluate these men, but that need not be your concern. As Christopher began to reply, the Kingsguard interrupted him. Even with Sir Arthur, Sir Valtrys, Sir Jeremy, and myself, the ranks of the Kingsguard are not yet full. Sir Jaime was a skilled warrior, but he was no true knight of the Kingsguard. His execution must be imminent, I assume? Sir Jaime will be pardoned for his crimes and released to his father, Christopher revealed. The Lord Commander's shock was palpable, his face growing red with anger. You would allow the greatest stain upon my order's history to live? After he murdered the man he was sworn to protect with his life? Christopher tilted his head slightly. This is about more than your order's history. King Aerys was no good king, and that will be our justification. I understand your oath, but I have need of Jaime in negotiations with his father. I would rather spare one disgraced knight than lose thousands in a war with Lord Tywin and the Westerlands. As the Lord Commander opened his mouth to protest, Christopher raised a hand, stopping him. This is not up for discussion. Promises have been made. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on Sir Barristan. He fought for Baratheon after his capture at the Trident, but he has been one of the Kingsguard's greatest members for over 2 decades and is regarded as a successor to Sir Duncan the Tall himself. The Lord Commander seemed to deflate slightly, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. Adam thought back to the stories he had heard as a child about Sir Barristan the Bold, how the knight had duelled Meleys the Monstrous during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Sir Barristan was more than just a knight, he was a living legend, and now they were to decide his fate. "My brother has erred and broken his oath to his king," Sir Gerald said quietly, a note of sorrow in his voice. I would speak with him, and if Sir Jaime is to live." Christopher nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. "You will have the chance to meet with him. A strong and fully staffed Kingsguard is one of my priorities. With your ranks dwindling, I felt it necessary to appoint at least 2 new knights. I would value your input on the remaining appointments." The Lord Commander considered this, then nodded. "Very well, Lord Hand. I will send for you once I have returned to the White Sword Tower," he said, his tone formal but respectful. With a final nod, he turned and departed. Adam watched the knight's departure, then turned back to Christopher. "Storm's End has fallen. Robert's brothers are dead or captured," Adam summarized, the weight of recent events pressing down on him. Christopher nodded, a hint of weariness creeping into his expression. "Indeed, and now we learn of another wife, Prince Rhaegar's pregnant wife, hidden away in Dorne." Adam paused, considering the weight of their conversation. But what does it change, really? Is this just another potential heir? Another pretender? Christopher sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to ease the tension there. "I'm not sure. Eddard Stark would be relieved to know his sister's alive, and that she was never kidnapped as we were led to believe." His voice trailed off, lost in thought. Adam nodded, then another thought struck him. But what of Robert Baratheon? If he learns of this, he'll be furious. Could that be something we could use against him? Christopher shrugged, a wary look in his eyes. Perhaps, though I doubt rage would be a weakness for Robert. If anything, it only makes him more dangerous. He glanced out toward the bay, watching as seagulls circled above. And then there's the matter of Dragonstone. Another prince, another queen, and no news since they were sent there. Christopher sighed deeply, his gaze following the seagulls as they drifted over the water. He muttered, almost to himself. We're bloody surrounded by them.